Okay, so today we're going to talk about using our sources effectively. We have three main objectives for this lesson. First, we're going to talk about quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing sources. These are the three ways that you can integrate sources into your writing, so we're going to talk about the differences between them. We're going to talk about using signal phrases, and finally using in-text citations. So, as I alluded to before, there are three ways to use your sources. First, you can quote a source. So when you quote a source, you are quoting them word for word, and the quote is being sandwiched between two quotation marks. This is the most obvious form of integrating a source, which we're all very comfortable and used to. So, for example, we might say Malala Yousafzai says, quote, "We realize the importance of our voices only when we are silenced." When we paraphrase, we are restating a sentence or a passage from a source in our own words. So an example of this would be if I wrote, "Malala recalls that the suppression of her right to free speech allowed her to fully appreciate her voice, perhaps more so than American teens." So here I am not quoting her word for word. I'm expressing her idea in my own words. And you'll notice that even though I am expressing her idea in my own words, I'm still using an in-text citation at the end, which we will talk about in the following slide. And then finally, we can summarize a source. When we summarize a source, that's similar to a paraphrase. However, this is when a paraphrase is about the same length and detail as the original sentence. It might even be longer than the original sentence. As you can see in this example, my paraphrase is longer than the original quote. When we summarize, we are making it smaller or reducing the size. So it's a more concise statement, again, written in your own words, of information, ideas, or even an entire argument from your source. So you might summarize the main claim and even the main reasons given and the main points of evidence given by your source. So you're taking something that is much lengthier and making it more concise. And just as you would do so, just like with a paraphrase, how you use an in-text citation at the end, you would definitely, if you summarize a source, you are still going to use this in-text citation at the end. So why cite your sources? So when we say cite a source, what we're really telling you to do is indicate when you've used a source. And you're going to do this for three reasons. One, it's ethical. So people have spent a lot of time coming up with these ideas, coming up with these words. That's labor, and we want to give them credit for their labor. More importantly for you, it allows you and your readers to recognize the boundaries between your ideas and those borrowed from your sources. So it's important to let your readers know where your thinking begins, where your original thinking begins, and where your source's thinking begins. So you want to sort of show the boundaries between what you believe and what are your original ideas and what your sources believe. Because quite often you might disagree with your sources. You might not fully believe 100% what they're saying or necessarily agree with how they're saying it. And so it's important for your readers, particularly in instances when you do disagree with your sources or don't quite see it the same way. It's very important to show where your thinking begins and where theirs ends. Also, even if you do agree, it's important to understand how your sources informed your thinking. So it's important to show what is new and original for you and to indicate through in-text citations what information, what evidence came from sources. And therefore sort of how it's important to show through in-text citations how your thinking has developed and grown through your sources. And finally, it adds to your credibility. So there's nothing, especially from a professor's perspective, there's nothing less credible than reading a paper that has no in-text citations, because one of two things has happened. Either They are passing off ideas. They're using the ideas and information and arguments that they found from sources, and they're passing it off as their own, which is unethical, and that constitutes plagiarism. So obviously, it reduces your credibility by suggesting you are unethical and that you are plagiarizing ideas. You're passing them off as your own. You can even, teachers will either ask you to rewrite the paper with that if it doesn't have in-text citations, or they might even just fail you for the assignment, and it is within their right to do so because it is technically plagiarism. But also, so one of two things happens: either you plagiarized or you did no research whatsoever. If there's no in-text citations, then that's a sign that either you plagiarized or you just didn't do any research, and that obviously is going to be a knock on your credibility. So you want to use in-text citations. These are your friends. These are something that's definitely going to help your credibility, and it's only going to improve the perception of that you are knowledgeable in the minds of your readers. So anytime, absolutely anytime we quote or paraphrase or summarize information, ideas, or arguments from a source, we are going to quote them. You're going to use an in-text citation. You're going to do so. A lot of times people will refer to the three sources rule. So if it's you'll hear quite often, if it's common knowledge, then you don't have to cite the source. And common knowledge is pretty difficult to define. So if you said, the American Revolution was in 1776, you probably don't need to cite that with the source because that's fairly common knowledge. No one's going to challenge you on that. It's not an original idea. It's pretty obvious common knowledge. However, how you define common knowledge is pretty tough. And sometimes you'll hear the rule that if you can find this exact fact in 3 sources or more, then it's common knowledge. That is an acceptable rule of thumb if you want to use that. My personal rule of thumb for students is oversight. So you're never going to get knocked. You're never going to get penalized for citing something that was common knowledge. Definitely err on the side of oversighting. So rule of thumb is if you found it, if it's an idea that you found from one of your sources, cite it. Whether you quote it, paraphrase it, or summarize it, make sure that you have an in-text citation at the end. And we'll go into more detail about in-text citations, but you're always going to quote, you're always going to cite your sources, no matter what. But even if you agree with them, even if it's an idea that you've had before and you agree with it, you're still going to cite that. So when we use sources, in addition to, we're going to have sort of 3 components to our source. We're going to have the information from the source itself in the form of a quote, paraphrase, or summary. And we're going to have a signal phrase, and we're going to have an in-text citation. So a signal phrase is a brief comment, such as according to, or as the author explains, which alerts your readers that the point is not your own. And if you go to page 141 of In Conversation, a Writer's Guide, you will find a list of some common attributes, which is very helpful. So examples are, according to so-and-so, the name of your source, John Smith acknowledged, then your quote. John Smith affirmed that. John Smith remarked. John Smith thought. John Smith commented. John Smith claimed. So definitely go and look at this list for when you're writing your own signal phrases, which are often sometimes called attributions. And then we're going to have our quote, summary, or paraphrase. We're going to have our signal phrase, and we're also going to have an in-text citation. So the in-text citation is the acknowledgement of source information, a last name and a page number in MLA style, which is what I'm asking you to use for your papers, at the end of the borrowed material. So these citations refer to a list of to your works cited at the end of the document. So when you refer to a source within your text, you're going to place the author's last name and a specific page number within parentheses. And those parentheses with the last name and the page number, that is the in-text citation. And one last thing to note is that if your source isn't paginated, so if there aren't page numbers for on your source, then you don't have to worry about page numbers. You will just include the last name. So here's two examples of using a source effectively. In this case, it's a quote. So we have the full sentence reads, Antero Garcia argues, education reform is the best solution for fixing our public schools. We have our signal phrase, which is Antero Garcia argues. We have our quote, and it's clearly bracketed, it's clearly set apart with quotation marks. Education reform is the best solution for fixing our public schools. And we have our in-text citation, which is the page number. And we don't have the last name in this in-text citation because the last name was included in the signal phrase. So if you use the author's last name in the signal phrase, then you do not need to include it in the in-text citation. Then you would just include the page numbers. But if you, in this case, here's an example where the last name was not included in the signal phrase. So if you wrote something like, experts agree that, quote, education reform is the best solution for fixing our public schools, then you would want to include that last name in your in-text citation. And one more thing to note is if the quote is a long quote and or you're summarizing a passage that takes place throughout multiple pages, then you would use a hyphen to indicate the page numbers. So if you're paraphrasing or summarizing, probably more likely, if you were summarizing 3 pages of text, then you would say 22 through 25 in your in-text citation. And then finally, we're going to have our works cited, which is that list of sources at the end of your paper, which your in-text citation should refer back to. So obviously, if this last name Garcia, you want to make sure that matches up with the last name, with the source in your works cited. So you want to make sure that everything cited anything that you do have an in-text citation for, there should be an author that lines up with that citation in your works cited. So here's a quick works cited checklist. I encourage you to look at page 400 of In Conversation for a detailed example of a works cited page. But here's your brief checklist. 1, it's going to begin on a new page at the end of the paper. And this is a hot tip. Make sure that you delete all the extra spaces in front of works cited. So there is nothing more frustrating or silly than seeing your works cited page start halfway, like at the halfway point of a paper. And that's clearly because, you're typing, and so all these spaces build up. You need to just go and make sure that you're deleting all those empty spaces so that your works cited page begins on a new page. It's at the top of a new page, not in the middle or towards the end. You'd be amazed if you just get rid of those empty spaces, like your grades actually might go up, because it's a sign to teachers that you just haven't proofread this or haven't really looked at the full document. So I do believe that your credibility as a writer will go up and your grades might actually improve. It's a really easy tip. Your works cited is also going to be alphabetized by author. If your source doesn't have an author, sometimes there's an unknown author, then you are going to start your works cited entry with the title of the source, and so you will just alphabetize that entry by the title of the source instead of the author. And